First is, of course, broad interest-based collectivities, trade unions, farmers' organizations, women's organizations, and so on. Membership-based with a lot of people based on interest. In many cases, class interest, but not all only class interest. Could be the interest of kids, the more specific interest of women, farmers, and so on. The second is what you say democracy, but if you just associate democracy with election, we go wrong. So this is more broadly in terms of democratic links between state and society. And society, in this view, needs to be based on equal citizens. And the third is, of course, social rights and welfare reform. And the fourth is what used to be called social growth pacts, that is, a kind of institutionalized class compromise between institutionalized class struggle, if you like, between labor, unions, and employers to agree on certain basic formula for how they can together promote reasonably meaningful development. The 5 strategies then, well, most of these strategies were actually very well summarized some years ago by Eric Olin Wright, the American sociologist. He had 4 of them, and I agreed with them. The first is get into the state and dismantle capitalism from above. You instead of private kindergartens, you have public kindergartens. Instead of private schools, you have public schools, and so on and so forth. The second is to tame capitalism by rules and regulations and some social programs and that sort of thing. That's of course well known. And the third is to resist capitalism from outside, like trade unions or action groups and that sort of thing. And you can also try to escape it by building cooperatives or a nice community of some kind where you try to survive without dealing so much with the market economy outside, etc. And the fifth is something which Eric Olin Wright didn't mention, but which was very common in Northern Europe, and I think has been applied in many other cases as well, is this attempt to build a series of transformative reforms. The best example I know is what we, in a slightly derogative term, have called state feminism in Scandinavia. That is that, women begin by demanding the right to vote. We were quite late in Sweden, for instance, only 1921. Okay, right to vote. What is the next reform? Well, maybe better conditions in the workplaces for women. Third might be welfare, public health issues for women. Fourth might be a better kindergartens, and so on and so forth. And for each step taken, the bargaining power of the women increases. You get into the workplaces, you get some money, you can stand on your own, you don't have to ask your husband for everything, etc., etc. So they over the years, these kind of reforms changed conditions for women, improved them, but also changed society. Men changed as well, and so on. So that's this kind of series of transformative reforms could, of course, apply for the economic and broader social sectors as well. And then this has been applied in 3 generations. So the first was the Industrial Revolution in the North, when there were also increasingly democratic nation states to implement the reforms. Then you had the second generation during the anti-fascist and anti-colonial, what used to be called second wave of democracy. And then you had the third wave of democracy, which also came together with the capitalist liberal globalization, so we got less emphasis during that period of statist imperialism, more market-driven imperialism. There was more space for democratization. So this forms a kind of framework. Next, please. Could we have next slide? Yeah. So if you put them together, like good political scientists, you have to draw figures like this. So So then you get a three-dimensional cube here. And if you start to count, you get 20 boxes during 3 generations. And of course, I didn't try to fill them all in. but it served as a kind of framework for asking questions to the material, a kind of prism through which I could look at. It's a kind of glasses to look through. So it was helpful in that sense. Next, please. The second thing I did was, of course, to compare these cases. You already know about it. I picked these 3 cases in particular. In India, it was primarily Kerala. There are also other things, but primarily Kerala in the southwest. Indonesia, of course, and the Philippines. And then I had some reference cases by cooperation with colleagues in South Africa and Brazil. And then I went back to the history of a northern case in this book, Sweden, being one of the critical cases for development of social democracy. But then there was a third thing that came to this, because I failed to write this book, you see. It turned either into some kind of collected works, which was boring, very, very boring and pretentious at that, or a very dense, theoretically structured book, which filled with footnotes and references and absolutely impossible to read for anyone who didn't have to. So I tried to find a way of doing it differently. So I did 2 things. I tried to reformulate my research questions as as detective stories, as mysteries. And then I imagined myself to be my idol, detective, Chief Inspector Morse, if anyone knows of that British television program. And I thought, okay, come on, Tornquist, now you're Morse here, and you formulate your problem, and you sit there listening to classical music, and you try to tell the story on how you try to solve this problem. So that was the way I was trying to build up the text, and it helped. So it became a bit more readable. But then, of course, it was still long. So I thought I had to find a way of reducing the length. And then I went back to all the interviews I'd made. At one point, I actually put up all the transcribed interviews I'd made, come to 1,632, and I put them on the floor. And then were all the interviews we had made together with demos and here in UGM, and I went back to notes among them. They came to something like 1,800 that I used at least. And a lot of my own logbooks, diaries, and photographs. And then I was trying to pick, you could say, illustrations of conclusions, illustrations of arguments from these sources. So instead, let me take a case from, instead of writing about how democracy activists in the Moluccas find it difficult to entirely support democracy, the established democratic system, and rather in many cases turn to ADAT regulations. So, writing, take page after page after page, trying to explain it. But I found one quote from interviewing the guy from Kachil there. Sorry, I lost his name right now. Arlo, yes, thank you. Arlo. I met him twice. In 2007, he had just won his village election. And I said, good, so now you're happy, aren't you? And he said, no. And I said, why aren't you happy? Well, you see, I would rather have been like to be elected by the Adat Council. And I said, why is that? Isn't democracy better than the Adat Council, this old feudal kind of thing? Well, I said, now I'm elected here, but democracy is a shame. It's dominated by bureaucrats and by business people, and they are going to weaken me and put up all kinds of restrictions. So, oh my God, I said, what shall we do then? What are you going to do? Well, we have to do both, he said, They have their resources in the bureaucracy and in the market. I have my other extra resources in the Adat community. So we have to rely on that as well. The good thing in the Adat community, that is, you know, the social trust and protection of environment. So we draw on that, and they can draw on the market, and I can retain my position in the democratic system. I think that was a good point, and it explained what he was doing. A second example was with the bad picture there, an old slide from Kerala in the 90s. You know, they were doing decentralization, democratic decentralization, and it was most dynamic out in the villages. So how do I tell people about that? It's not easy. It's not easy to get them to understand, in particular, to get them to understand that this is not a boring meeting where old chaps are just sitting you know, formally deciding things. These are dynamic discussions, and almost like a seminar in our departments. Only difference is that these guys knew much better what is going on. So by showing that little picture of the intense discussions when they were trying to convince me of something, it did help, and I could use it. The third example I want to give you is, you know, trying to explain to people how the market, the global market, is reaching out even to the smallest little fishing community on a reef in between Cebu City and Bohol in the southern Philippines. That also takes it takes a number of pages. It's quite difficult to really get people to understand, and it takes a lot of space. So I decided to show this picture and tell the story. You see, there is a little Greek temple there. Can you see on the white reef, right? And I said to the fishing village, which is just where I take the picture, and they were isolated from this beautiful white beach. So I said, why are you isolated from that lovely beach? Why can't the kids play around in the beach? And what is that funny Greek temple over there? We said, you know, there was a businessman from Cebu City. He has occupied the right beach to take out tourists so that they can swim there. But what about the temple then? Well, you see, they were screening a film, a pornographic Japanese film. Next page, please. So, you know, the fourth question to be asked then, were there any new results beyond previous texts? Because I was using material, also updates, of course, but were there any new results then? Or did I just summarize? Now, I think there were some new results because I was rereading retrospectively through the lens that I tried to tell you about social democracy and so on. So I think there were some new insights on that basis. Next, please. So let me turn to the conclusions. The first general point that I try to make is that the crisis of social democracy is obviously global. If you come to Sweden and talk to radical people, they will say it's homemade. They will focus on the domestic stuff. And wherever you go around the world these days, they tend to be sort of homegrown explanations for everything. But I like to emphasize that it is global. Let me take an example for the case of the North. If I go back to Sweden, then the crisis developed already in the 70s. And it was largely due to international undermining of what had until then been a very successful Keynesian-oriented development strategy, you could say, in Sweden. But it was nationally confined, but now it was undermined by international factors. What was it that undermined this Keynesian thing? Well, look at the picture. It was the Vietnam War. Not the Vietnam War as such, but that in the early 70s, you know, the Americans decided to break up what was known as the Bretton Woods Agreement on international regulation of finance, so that they would get help to finance the war in Vietnam. And that changed the preconditions for everything around the world in terms of capacity to build national Keynesian-based development. Second thing was, of course, the oil crisis. You remember maybe from the early 70s. It wasn't much of a problem in Sweden that the sheikhs in the Gulf areas increased the prices if they had used the money to buy things from Sweden. But they didn't do that, right? They put their money in banks in Switzerland instead. So, and speculation. And that made very much of a difference. So, and then you had the authoritarian industrialization, low wage-based industrialization in primarily East Asia, resulted in, of course, restructuring, quite painful restructuring of industry in our countries. The picture is from the tearing down on the main structure in the shipyard in my own hometown. And then guys like Olof Palme and Willy Brandt, some of you might remember these leaders, they were trying to find a solution to this. And what was the solution in their way of looking at it? Well, it was to internationalize the Keynesian strategy, you could say. So demand-based growth more globally. The only problem was that they wrote reports like the North-South report, partnership between North and South, new economic world order, etc., etc. But they failed, as we know. It was an absolute failure. The question is then why, and the failure opened up for Maggie Thatcher and Reagan and the neoliberal development. Right, and why did they fail? We'll come to that very soon, but one major reason was the weakness of their partners in the South. The anti-colonial movement had been weakened. So we come to that in a minute. But the global crisis is also because of this failure, and it's of course in the South also because of the inconclusive promotion of democratization during the third wave of democracy. But we have to return to this question. Next, please. Why? The first mystery is then, why did the initially so impressive anti-colonial movement partners that Palme and Brandt and the others were thinking of, why were they unable to make better progress? Well, we just will recall what we are talking about. I have the picture there is of course from Bandung, right? And the second picture down there is from the installation of the first communist, basically social democratic oriented, the first, you say, radical left movement, elected radical left movement in the world in Kerala in 1957. So they did very well here, and they did very well in Indonesia also. I mean, if you think Kerala won the election in 1956-57, and in Indonesia, the reformist communists won the local elections in 1957 as well. Not it wasn't nationwide, but in the core parts of Indonesia, and everybody knew they would win a universal election. So why did they fail? Next, please. Well, so it is instructive to compare the fate of Indonesia and Kerala in this respect. They were the most successful around the globe at that period of time, as I said. But in Indonesia, in contrast to Kerala, but just like in many other cases, the initially successful democratization was downgraded. And you know what it was? It was about support for guided democracy. They abandoned the free elections. They abandoned much of the ethos for equal civil rights, etc., in favor of anti-imperial, anti-feudal left populism. In addition, that meant that it was increasingly difficult to fight the state capture that was going on during that period of time. So you couldn't fight really what Dick Robson and others have called the state grabbing, the state capture, or the thus political initiation of capitalism. This was, of course, not the abandoning of democracy at the time was, of course, not just because of the reformist communists. You know, the West-oriented socialists in Indonesia, in PSI, and the liberals in Masumi and so on, they also abandoned democracy at the time, supporting in the end the military. So, you know, betting on what Samuel Huntington called politics of order. We have to have strong state institutions before we can have any kind of democracy. Next, please. So, as I said, without democratization, it was now difficult to fight the political and often statist pathways to capitalism. And result was genocide and Suharto's new order. And I don't need to tell more about that in this context. Kerala, however, did reasonably well. It stood tall and continued to do so. They continued, for instance, to resist in the 70s, the state of emergency, and after that made important advances in West Bengal as well. So they were reasonably successful. But in Indonesia and the global south in general, we got 2 decades of both West and East supported what used to be called middle class coups, or those who were supported by Moscow was of course called national development or non-capitalist development, and China was giving support for guerrilla movements and so on. So during this period, you know, from left to right, all negated democratization. Nothing. Next, please. Things changed then with the third wave of democracy. And just, you know, it started, where did it start? Well, it started with the girl giving the flower to the rebellious military officers in Portugal, in Lisbon, 74, when fascism was overthrown there. It spread to Spain, it spread to Greece. In second picture, it was coming to Manila in 86 with the People Power Revolution. It was then the fall of the wall and the fact that we even got a poet in power in Prague. You had Nelson Mandela coming back from prison and a new regime in South Africa, and you had your own successful overthrow of Suharto in Indonesia. I mean, this was just glimpses of a worldwide wave of democratization that came up, and everybody were quite optimistic. But it turned unconvincing, and now it's regressing. And the worst case is, of course, in Russia, where there were signs of some kind of democratization, but has now turned into a kind of imperial Bonapartism, perhaps even worse. So the question we need to ask is why? So, please, next, please. So the main conclusions that I arrived at are the following. The first is that democratization was not backed up by social democratic oriented industrial and welfare policies. You know, this is in sharp contrast to what happened after the Second World War in Europe, with the Marshall Aid and similar measures. So nothing like that happened in the global south after the World War. So the result of this is, of course, we don't get any kind of inclusive development, and we get a very scattered and weak working class. So social growth pacts are also unfeasible because you don't have strong unions, enough strong unions and enough strong employers. It's also a very scattered picture, difficult. So very, very generally speaking, class is not enough to be, class loyalties, class-based organizing is not enough. We can, of course, discuss details of this, but it's very clear. Even if you go to South Africa, even if you go to Brazil with much larger working class organizations, this thesis, I think, hold true. The second is, of course, that we need broader alliances, and many of us were engaged in trying to build these broader alliances by relating to civil society organization, urban poor groups, and so on and so forth. Polycentric social movements would, we hoped, be able to get together and rally so many people who were not unionized. But as we have to conclude, I think, and when I go through these experiences and our experiences and others' experiences, the general conclusion is that bottom-up is simply not enough, not even in Kerala, where this was sort of tried most consistently. So then many thought that democratization itself would bring people together and unite us for going ahead. But democratization, as we know, was captured by these pacts, these compromises, on the one hand, by accommodating the old powerful people, the elites, allowing them to retain private assets or privatize public resources they had controlled, and to negotiate new rules and regulations, which made it quite almost impossible for civil society organizations, unions, and others to really make a difference within the new setup, within the new system. And on top of that, all this was basically supported by the international actors, by development aid agencies and so on. So democratization was shallow and simply not enough. Meanwhile, in the north, interestingly, in Sweden, for instance, we Social Democrats briefly managed to get back to power in 2014, and we had a trade union leader to become the new prime minister, and he said he realized very much we had to do something to the international conditions and so on and so forth. There was a new attempt made, but it capsized within 1.5 years. And that was because nobody had supported the pro-democrats sufficiently well in the Middle East. So they lost the Arab Spring, beautiful attempts lost. They weren't any support in particular, any support for the pro-democrats in Syria. They lost, and we got a catastrophic refugee crisis in Europe. And when the refugees reached up even to Scandinavia, we tried first to receive them, but then after some time couldn't do anything. So then they were up against the wall and were risking to lose votes to the new, neo-nationalist right-wing movements that would say, get to hell with you people. So the Social Democrats turned 180 degrees and turned very inward again, and putting up walls against the external threats, you could say. Yep. So, conclusion. The third conclusion: are there then any openings in the South at all? Well, I think there are, and we have to look at this because it has proved possible to build broad alliances, really. And one of the best cases, since we are short of time, and I just say that Kerala is probably the best case right now related to their measures against COVID-19 and to handle that. But the case in Indonesia, which is most impressive, is the broad alliances built around the struggle for the public health reform. And that wasn't just built by, the remarkable thing there was that it brought together progressive politicians, unions, civil society organizations, and so on. But it wasn't just built from below. It was also built by legislative proposals in the parliament and by technocrats, you could say, engaged in that process. And it proved that people could not unite from below on the basis of their specific interest, but behind a broad reform proposal. And I think that is very promising. And we see examples of similar ways of bringing people together and elsewhere. There are two problems. This is the final slide. There are two major problems. The first is there wasn't a series of similarly good reforms. So, you managed to fight for this reform, but when victory is there, people return to their scattered activities and continue to work together on similar next step reforms, like in what I told you about state feminism and so on. The second was the lack of democratic partnership governance. So they resorted to populist direct democracy. non-institutionalized form of cooperation. Suddenly, Said Iqbal turned to Prabowo, others turned to Jokowi. On the local level, you have similar patterns. People turn to various politicians. You get all kinds of horse trading. And the technocrats in the government sitting trying to draft fine reforms are losing any kind of popular base. But it's not impossible to do anything in this regard. These are not structural problems. These are political problems. And I think we need to give priority to them. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Uli, for the excellent presentation. I take several notes about the discussion, but I will keep it for the question and answer session. And we will move on to the discussion session. We will have our first discussion. Ibu Amalinda Saverini from the Department of Politics and Government, Universitas Gadjah Mada. You may deliver your critical response about Prof. Uli's book. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, moderator, for this opportunity. First of all, I want to congratulate you for this book. It seems like you are about to conclude your long, more than 3 decades, you said in the book, as a scholars and also as a scholars come activists in the 3 countries that you have carefully examined, carefully understood, and carefully run. So I guess it feels like when you mentioned earlier you are being a detective, now I understand why that's the case, because I agree with you, it's quite impossible. You have maybe a series of 10 books to write if you have the whole, quotations or reference, and even reference can be one book itself, I guess. So now I understand why these detective ways of writing the book, and I think it's really useful in a way. Like I can just imagine you being with Bang Asmara Nababan, the late Asmara Nababan, and you're talking with you mentioned earlier the fishermen in the Kei Island, and many stories that you seems to brought us there, to really understand it. So I guess that's really the strength of this book. And also that now I understand, because that will be my first question, where is the reference, when I read this book. But then I understand, because it just takes too much to do that. So I also at the same time feel like, because you're already retired now, and this is kind of your maybe final, I hope not, to really reflect on what you've been doing, particularly in Indonesia. That's all the chapters that I read in this book, because it's really rich. That's my first point. The second point is that you mentioned earlier that you try to, despite the fact that you want to convey the main message of the book through storytelling or kind of detective way, which reminds me, by the way, with Tan Malaka book, he also feel like you are there with him when he was like moving around the places, cities, to avoid the regime and promote the communism at the time. So it just feel like reading the same books. But I cannot help to, being a scholar myself, to kind of connect your 3-dimensional boxes that you mentioned earlier. Yeah, and then I still make a mark in page 21 and try to kind of miss the way you try to fit the, page number 21 with these 3 boxes, the 3-dimensional boxes, and how you then analyze each of the cases over. So, for instance, the strategies that mentioned Ehrlich, Olin, Wright, dismantle, tame, resist, escape, and transform. I kind of miss how do you then analyze the case of Indonesia, for instance. How do you put the cases in the beginning of the Reformasi and after Reformasi in the lenses of Erik Olin Wright's perspective, right? Because it's kind of blur, but I also understand that because it's going to be another book if you keep doing that in detail, right? But because I think it's quite interesting to see when the dismantle happened, when the taming, resisting, escaping, and transformation happened in the case that you elaborate, at least in Indonesia. So that's make me wonder to connect this. You know, this is a typical scholar's academic question. You don't have to answer that, but but I just find really the rich material can be really framed in that way, right? So that's what my thought on it. But the other thing, Ola, maybe this is the third point. In the late 1960s or early 1960s or 1960, there's a debate between Herbert Faith and Hari Benda. Maybe you remember. The question is, Herbert Faith wrote The Decline of Indonesian Constitutional Democracy, right? And at the end of the book, he asked questions. Why democracy failed in Indonesia, right? And his mentor, his teacher, Hari Benda, asked the totally different questions. Why should democracy be present in Indonesia? Because there's no way, there is no infrastructure, there is no existing requirement in Indonesia to democracy to prevail, right? So thinking about that question, I kind of tempt to ask the similar frame of questions on this book. Why? It seems to me that you asked the question, why new social democracy does not exist in Indonesia? In a Hari Benda way of asking, why should it be? Because if you look at from the perspective of Sweden perspective, looking at Indonesia case and also Kerala in Philippines, it seems like the basic requirement is not there, including what you also mentioned in one of your pages about the fiscal capacity. There is no fiscal capacity in Indonesia. The one that you mentioned about the SJSN, Social Security System, National System of Social Security, it basically now getting down because simply no fiscal capacity. At the level of regulation bill, it stated really clear that all citizens in Indonesian state will guarantee or will provide basic rights for the whole universal principle, right? But if you go down to the lower scale of the regulation, it's basically the other way around. It's basically refute what is mentioned in the constitutions. So I wonder whether this is what you somehow also touch upon. This is about fiscal capacity that is just difficult. And you mentioned also the difference between Sweden and Norway, right? The way it is operate. So I guess getting back to Hari Benda type of questions, perhaps my question will be, what is the requirement to have this new social democracy, right? So that's really what I think can be discussed at these occasions. And apart from, I guess your perspective is really from the social movement perspective, right? The Border Alliance, democratic partnership, governance, and all that. But at the same time, I think there is another requirement for that system to prevail. And other thing that I'm kind of curious, Ole, because maybe I missed it in the book, but when you said it's a new, in search of new social democracy, I wonder what do you mean by new here? Is it new? What's new? What is, how do you, maybe you need to explain a bit, because maybe I missed it. What's the new about this social democracy that you claim to be? Is it because of the contextualized type of social democracy at the global south? Or is it because of basically broader alliance and combination between broader alliance, democratic governance, top-down and bottom-up kind of things? Because in Europe, perhaps it's mostly or in majority is bottom-up, right? Is it that? Because I was not really clear at the end of the book. Let me see. Okay, relate to my other point earlier, Ole, or maybe my last point, whether I understand you try to compare between 3 countries in global south and Sweden, right? And I also understand you try to see Indonesia as a whole, as an archipelago. But at the same time, there is a kind of limitation to do so because we kind of focus on the question of what is wrong, rather than what is right. What I mean is that it's just very recent, the national legislative body approved the bill on sexual violence eradications, right? I think that's a really major improvement, a major, what do you say that, a major achievement after such a long period of advocacy from the civil society perspective, right? So, so how do we then position this in the, maybe this is about methodology or approach, whether you want to approach like trying to make a pattern in the whole country, or whether you want to kind of showing some strength or some success story, right? Maybe that's really the case, but I kind of disturbed by the way this approach of having it a big stories, national scale. I think it kind of miss good example or achievement from the Indonesia civil society movement, including like also very recent. One of colleague here at the Fisipol UGM was a part of the movement on the ride-hailing driver Gojek, motorcycle ride-hailing association, workers association that succeed in asking one of the requirement policy from the company. The policy of the company said that you are not allowed to join strike, right? So it is dropped now because of the kind of public pressure to the Gojek to take down that one of particular. That's really good thing, I think, right? So my point is that, again, this is perhaps approach methodology. There are small stories around us, around very recent, which it seems to me that doesn't really fit with the way, or maybe the question is it part of the new social democracy that we can also analyze but see it in a different way, or not, right? Another thing is like Indonesia is growing and the new generation is coming, young people being active, but in a different way, They don't really join, how to say that, union. They have smaller, but very massive movement with different type of sectors, different type of issues, right? So I wonder, what I kind of miss also in this book is like this. So generation is not just about the three that you mentioned in your page 21, third wave, anti-colonial, industrial, but also I think, this newer generations coming in with a different way of looking politics, with a different way looking of organizing, with a different way of strategy to do to express their demand. And that's really kind of that I kind of miss in the book, and including the technology, which maybe if you have another chance, that can be part of the maybe series 2 of this new social democracy. I guess that's all. Ola, once again, congratulations. And I think it's a very, very good book. And usually what I always get from you is a reflection. Usually when after I read your book, it gives you a way to reflect. And then maybe it's not directly relate, but it facilitates you to think more. That's what I always like from your book. So thank you. And I give you back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Mbak Linda. Excellent remarks by reflecting on the contemporary case of Indonesia. Okay, and then we will move on to the next discussion. We will have present before us today, Mas Muhammad Najib Aska. He is a senior lecturer from the Department of Sociology, UGM. Mas Najib, you may deliver.
Hello. Oh, okay. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the moderator and also the faculty for inviting me to this important and a very interesting occasion of the book discussion, the new book written by Professor Ole Thornquist. I think we met first in Paris in 2004 during Eurasia's conference. That is the first time I think I met you directly, yeah. And I think you don't change a lot until today. I mean, kind of your hair and also your energetic way in presenting and arguing something. I think that's wonderful. And to meet again now, I think almost 20 years after that. First of all, I think I would like to congratulate and give a very high appreciation to this book. I think this is a fantastic book. Yeah, I really enjoy reading this book, although thick and with a small font of letters and also quite dense kind of space of the. But this is a very rich with data, with stories, with analysis, yeah, which are presented and written sharp, with also passionate, but without loss of clarity and erudition. That is, I think, one of the wonderful things from this book. And as you said already, that you wrote this book more as a kind of detective rather than a writer, yeah, to put from the beginning about the mystery and how to solve that kind of mystery. So that's maybe another reason why I enjoy reading this book much, yeah. So more kind of watching a film rather than reading a book. Yeah, yeah. That is my first impression of the book. And the second one, I think I really appreciate this kind of work because of this is actually the result of very long engagement of you. I think about 50 years, maybe almost 50 years, yeah. In your engagement, long and intense engagement with your grassroots pro-democratic movement in some countries, especially Indonesia, Philippines, and India, yeah, as a representative of the South. And then how your finding and your insight from the South actually have a kind of implication to the North and the vice versa, actually, yeah. Actually, how the crisis of social democracy in the global stage, yeah, especially in the Europe and the North, actually giving a significant contribution to the failure also of the same kind of new democracy in the South, as you then discuss it deeply. I try to, let's say, place actually the book, actually, which is actually the big question that you are going to answer or to solve the mystery is why it is so difficult to renew broadly framed social democracy in the global South before and during the third wave of democracy, and how this matters in the North too, and if a new social democracy is feasible, as also you put in your introduction. So this is, I think, a very important book, and in how you try to link actually the story, the insight that you got from the South, especially in these three countries, and how it actually reflecting the, let's say, the story of the failure of the journey of social democracy, both in the South and also in the North. I then would like to more give a kind of question to interrogate further, to expand of the discussion, and also maybe some kind of little critique to the book. Before moving to that, I would like to want more thing about what the fun of reading or enjoying this book is actually about the pictures. So the pictures is really telling about the lot of things, yeah, actually about your memories, of course, but also the really meaningful engagement of you with many actually scholar and activists, yeah, in several countries, including like in Indonesia, how you have some really nice picture of Arif Budiman, late Arif Budiman, for example, yeah. Also some friend who passed away already, such as Mas A.E. Priyono, yeah, and some other people. Asmara Nababan, Linda mentioned before. So wow, this is really interesting and also giving sense of too many people, maybe which is actually maybe not having opportunity to meet with some of them, actually how actually such kind of engagement is really strong, really important in making actually the story and the struggle actually in the grassroots level, it's actually happening. And another one which is also helpful from this book is actually about that you presenting a timeline, the timeline of the social and political changes in each of that countries, and also the each of article. For example, when you talk about Indonesia in the let's say the third generation of social democracy, yeah, actually in the process, early process to democratic transition, and also how it also happened in the post authoritarian period. Yeah, so for me that is really informative and very helpful, and also very help actually the reading actually to understand the whole story, while you then put in some, let's say small story, yeah, from for example from Batang, for example, or from Aceh, actually put it in the big picture of how Indonesia transforming. Yeah. Okay, I then move to a kind of question, which is I hope it will provoke discussion further from all friends coming here. So actually, I really hope that each of us actually giving like some comment and question, and also what the insight from this book. Yeah. The first one is actually about, it is more about global things. Yeah. You talk about actually the failure of our, let's say, heroes such as Willy Brandt and Olof Palme, in the global level, how they actually attempt to revive the global order of kind of social democracy, actually eventually defeated by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and how they then actually reviving and making neoliberal maybe democracy work until today, maybe until today. But there is also some crisis, which is actually for me important crisis in the global level, where actually the neoliberal status and regime actually was under strain and under attack, such as the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. How then actually such crisis actually contribute to the possibility of the coming of the, let's say, new kind of social democracy? As we know, such a case in America itself, for example, there is the Obamacare, yeah, following that kind of crisis. Yeah, so I think that for me, that is also a sign of the new kind of, I don't know, new kind of social democracy actually emerged in very significant in the global power. I mean, at least in US, that is of course giving a big influence to the world. And what is actually, we put this kind of story into the big puzzle of you have discussing in the global level. And the second one is actually, as also you raise kind of question actually in the end of your book, actually about what is actually the different, and also the link between the two, that social democracy, yeah, or the democratic socialism actually, and how this different and also similar, and but also difference is actually it is just simply work to each other, or what is actually there are some tension in between, or maybe we need to come with a new framework, or you put in your book actually we need to think out of the box, let's say out of the box. We need to new framework maybe to understand this whole story of the change, of the transformation in the global level, and so on. And you place also the what such as the Stiglitz, yeah, he proposed a sort kind of progressive capitalism. Is that what do you think about that? I wonder how then try to analyze actually the, let's say, the tension, the contestation of the social democracy, democratic socialism, and kind of progressive capitalism. Is that another possibility for the future, for example? And another one is actually one of the important conclusion of your book is actually that the crisis of social democracy is global, right? Yeah, and you place put any evidence and so on and so on, and as evidence to support that kind of argument and so on and so on. But my question is there that global social democracy is possible, or is that just kind of an illusion actually? Maybe we don't really need that kind of new, let's say, global kind of social democracy. Maybe what is really need is just local social democracy, which is actually destroyed by the coming of the democratic electoral democracy and capitalism and so on, which is actually, as you mentioned, also the case of the Kecil, right? How then actually the such local system, which is maybe served for the people, but then it's destroyed by the new system of democracy, a new system of electoral democracy, but also the presence of global capitalism, of course, as you put the picture of there nicely about the how then the beach should be could be controlled by one business, national business, and so on and so on and so on. So that's kind of things actually coming to my mind actually, that maybe illusion, or what kind of actually the things. And maybe the last thing is actually about maybe a little kind of critic also, like Linda actually on the a little bit confusing about the figure 1 on the pillar strategies and generation of social democracy in one cube. I think I don't really help reader to understand actually how these 3 axes actually work together, yeah, about the pillars, about the strategies and generation. So that kind of cube is not sufficient for me, from myself, in explaining and simplifying actually the different kind of element of analysis, which is very, very wonderful. But we maybe need to find a new way to explaining this kind of access to work together in explaining the complex analysis of you and doing that. Last thing maybe about I miss one important thing actually, which is actually now everywhere, now become the real part of our life, is actually about the digital things. Yeah, the digital things, the digital realm, digital issues. I mean, in the whole discussion of the in search of new social democracy, you never mention about how the influence of digital technology, digital revolution, digital transformation to this kind of story. So such as what is happening is just, yeah, classic old style of life, which is now actually disrupted by digital technologies and so on. So I wonder how to put this kind of thing into the story. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mas Najib, for the splendid remarks. And but before we move on to the question and answer session, I will give the opportunity to Prof. Ule, if you want to respond to some burning questions raised by Mbak Linda and Mas Najib.
Does it work? I'll take this instead. You hear me now? Good. Thank you so much. Very exciting comments, and I think I try to combine some of the questions and critique, very constructive critique at that. The first thing I'd like to address is this Linda's point about Herb Feith and Harry Bedah. Yeah, you know, I was by Dick Robertson always called me a kind of idealist of the same kind as Herb Feith, but I think I can take that. But the point was that when Bedah brought up his points, I thought he was restricted by, confined to the modernization school way of thinking. kind of assuming that modernization had to, in the global south, had to go about in more or less the same way as in the north. Yeah. And I think therefore, you know, the point by him and so many others at the time that Indonesia was, there was a lack of conditions, preconditions. We have to first give, you know, Samuel Huntington say we have to have politics of order, we have to have strong institutions first, etc., etc., etc. I think they are mistaken by the simple fact that they never tried the other possibility that things may happen in slightly different ways. And that's exactly why I bring in Kerala, because Kerala is the place in India which has the most had the most rigid caste system, so many religions, so underdeveloped in many ways, and yet it proved capable of building a stable democracy and make advances to become, in the global south, one of the most successful human development indicators, and even in terms of growth is doing reasonably well. So I think we have to question that reference of Bedah. It doesn't mean that I therefore subscribe entirely to Herfeet's idealism, but we can be open to another way of phrasing it. Are there other avenues? And of course, clearly you could say about other avenues by what happened in South Korea and China and Taiwan and so on, but even though they were more authoritarian. So I think that perspective, I had problems with Bedah's perspective as well as with others who use that modernization perspective from that point of view. Okay, what is new? What is a new social democracy? Well, it's in the most simple answer to it is what I try to say, try to spell out in terms of the resequencing of the order in which the pillars have been promoted. In the first generation, the fourth pillar of social pact was seen and often de facto turned into a prerequisite for the strong state, welfare state. So, and that was always, so there were constant attempts in the global south to construct something like a social pact to create those preconditions. Of course, in East Asia, it was turned into an authoritarian way of doing that, in South Korea in particular, in Singapore and so on. But Singapore is special, we forget about that. But and Nehru tried a very statist, top-down developmental state kind of way of doing it. But I think that what we see here now is a possibility of doing it the other way around. That is, to build sufficiently strong organizations, collectivities, through the promotion of production-oriented welfare programs, like the public health reform, if you put it in a series of reforms. And I think that's exactly what they are trying to do now in Kerala as well, to put up a good example, yet a good example, that is on the basis of education, on the basis of social welfare, on the basis of public health, not in particular, to build up now, having the preconditions for a knowledge-based development strategy, which was a pact on that. So, you know, in terms of the pillars, that is what I mean by new social democracy. Then we can turn to the newness in terms of strategies, and I would say, no, perhaps not so new, but to renew the fifth strategy, which also makes me helps me to return to some questions about disciplining capitalism and all of that. The fifth strategy in terms of series of transformative reforms. That was forgotten for long periods of time. And the first time it was brought up, I think, was by a theoretician in 1920s in Scandinavia. But it has been practiced elsewhere. I think coming back to that focus on series of transformative reforms would also be included in what I mean by a new social democracy. And maybe also the emphasis on the importance of negotiative frameworks and representative partnership governance rather than leftist populism. So these three things, if you were to press me, would be the newness of social democracy that I had in mind. The comparison stuff, and Linda, you had a good point there about, you know, national scale and local and so on. Well, of course, I accept the critique. It's always difficult to tell a story for people and who don't know exactly what happened in Batang or in Kota Baru in the southeast of Kalimantan, and can keep all these things in mind. You always have to give references to the larger context. But I hope that I've been able to bring up local cases and to have them to signify broader developments. Taking the story of Handoko, for instance, to illustrate that this kind of local alliances that are better known from Solo or Jakarta was also tried out in a local context, and that how it was done there. So that's how I have tried at least to tackle it. Just a final thing about this combination of the framework and all these dimensions. I would like to defend myself a little bit by saying that just like Chief Inspector Morse, just like Chief Inspector Morse is sitting there in his sofa, he doesn't, and he has a mystery case. Somebody has been killed, and we need to solve that mystery. But he is not coming up with all his toolboxes. I mean, he's not even, he has a toolbox, and I have my toolbox, but I'm not using everything in that toolbox every time I have a murder case, because some of it is not very relevant. Some is more important. So I sort of bring up the toolbox when the murder case calls for it.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Ule, for your response. Okay, we will now enter the question and answer session. Actually, we have had several questions raised online on the Zoom, but to increase our interaction between participants who attend this event online, I will give the chance first for the participant who attend on the venue today. For the participant who attend here, is there anyone who want to raise a response or question for Prof. Ule, or maybe for the discussion? Sekalian, Mbak. Mas Joas. Okay. Okay, please state your name, institution, and your response.
Ole, thank you very much for your presentation. I just need clear explanation from you about your statement in the conclusion, in the third conclusion. You said that the problem is political, not structural. But if look back in your book, I think you discuss about how to construct the popular interest collectivities. And there is three ways: ideology, politicization, mobilization, organization, and structural and institutional opportunity. I can not make a clear understanding about this kind of your statement. This is political, not structural, but back to your explanation about how to build up the collectivities in this kind of project of new social democracy. You said that it's very structural, I think, the way we construct the popular collectivities. My question is, what do you mean? Not the structural, but the politicals. What do you mean about this kind of statement? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mas. Prof. Ule, do you wish to answer this response directly?
Short answer. I say that, don't quote me more or less. No, but I say that to counter, which takes us back to Bedah. I say that to counter the argument by a number of our good friends like Bedah or you know, Dick Robson or so many others of the structuralist school who are doing wonderful analysis, but sort of indicate that, no, there isn't any chance. There isn't any, you know, we have to have all these better conditions, these economic conditions. We don't have the big middle class, which is interested in this. We don't have the production-oriented capitalists and so on and so forth. And my argument is that you know, that I doubt that is the main problem. It is possible to come forward if we give more consideration to the social democratic idea of advancing by democratization.
Do you want to give another response? Okay, thank you. Okay, and then now we have another response, or to be specific, question raised online by Ayu, my lecturer from Department of International Relations, now in Florida. Mbak Ayu raised 3 questions actually, but I think we have 2 that are more contextualized on the debate. The first is, I will read it directly from text. Your argument sounds very path dependent, in a sense that an opening for social democracy is almost impossible in countries without strong leftist force. In line of Mbak Linda's question, strong leftist forces. In line of Mbak Linda's question, is there any possibility that social democratic agenda is built on different kind of progressive movement that does not necessarily resemble European class-based leftist movement? And for the second question, I think this is important to be raised. In some cases of democratic transition, civil society movements that broke in democracy cannot sustain similar level of participation and mobilization after transition to democracy. Hence, shallow democracy. For example, if we see in the failure of the Odpor or Solidarność in Poland to become strong forces that help democratic deepening in Serbia and Yugoslavia. Why do you think some broad-based social movements that manage to usher in democracy eventually fail in sustaining post-transition democratic engagement? Do you want to respond to this question directly?
I think that the book is addressing the issue that it is possible to build broader movements than simply class-based movement. I think that is a very basic argument in the book, that we have to build broader social movements and political movements. And how do we do it? Well, it seems that the only way that has worked is what we have learned, including from Indonesia, on how it was possible to rally behind, you know, agreements on livable cities, agreements for the public health reform, agreements on civic rights combined with anti-corruption measures and social rights, as was tried out in the case of Handoko's support for the alternative Bupati election in Batam. So I think that is the kind of message the positive message I try to advance. I'm not sure that captured the second question. It's about mass organizations.
Why do you think some group-based social movement that managed to usher in democracy eventually fail in sustaining their organization democratic engagement?
Why they failed to sustain themselves?
In Poland, for example.
In
Poland.
In Poland, well, in Poland the Solidarność was entering into cooperation with the Roman Catholic Church and entered into cooperation with reformist organizations and to strike deals on representation in future governments. So in a sense, I'm not sure that the aim of that organization from the beginning was wider than that. It was a protest movement, was combining trade union demands with protest movement, and they managed to contribute to democratization in Poland in a rather remarkable way. But then, of course, we can turn into what happened in Poland after the fall of the wall, and Eastern Europe. What you see these days in Eastern Europe, and even more in Russia, is exactly similar to that which happened to the global South after the Second World War. That they didn't benefit from anything similar to the Marshall Aid. They didn't benefit from the Bretton Woods Agreement, those kind of post-war agreements that fostered the rise of social democratic oriented governments and reforms in Northern Western Europe. So we have to recall that, but I can't give a better answer to that. But if you had phrased your question, if I change it a little bit, why didn't the Arab Spring movements, for instance, the protest movements in the Arab Spring, why didn't they do better? And there I think it is very clear two things. The first thing is that they were lacking any kind of organizational link from the street and upwards. There was no form of negotiating, discussing, institutionalizing their demand. The only exception was Tunisia. Which is also the only case which isn't a total catastrophe. The second factor was, of course, the lack of international support and protection. But the organizational factor there, I think, is very, very clear. If you want yet a positive example, which I haven't been able to cover in my book, yes, let's all study what happened in Chile, how the students in Chile managed to broaden their movement for their rights and for civil rights and combining it with the social rights, the welfare rights in the country, and basically changed the constitution and even winning election and now being in government. I'm sorry I couldn't cover it in my book, but that is just a very, very good example on what I would advocate.
Thank you, Professor Ule, for your response. Before we move on into another question raised online, I would like to invite another participant who attend this venue here. Do you have other response that want to be addressed to Prof. Ule? Oh yeah.
Thank you. You apprise the BPJS scheme as kind of the best case of social democracy in Indonesia, but seems to me this is just different mode of capitalism operation, because it's basically insurance company and insurance business with modification and the way the state in setting up the structure is not well set, because the provision of capital for operating the scheme are not really secure from the beginning, and meaning that the design are not really fit, because those who meant to contribute and finance, some are like voluntary somehow, some are mandatory, and the lack of clarity makes the scheme failing and end up with the problem in financing the services for the people. Now, is it simply because of the institutional design, or is it because of the structural aspect which still taking shape in making the scheme are not really well performed? But at least there is a gesture, there is an evidence in Indonesia that the model of social democracy you are saying is still feasible, and also in the matter of how to organize it, rather than the political force or broad alliance that you are talking about, meaning that the structural opportunity are still there, and also the political basis for Indonesia to run social democracy. That just simply because we are not really having consensus and a framework in organizing, because similar scheme to the one run by the state are also available in the community. And you from the beginning remind me, when we learn about social democracy in Indonesia is completely having different setup with Scandinavia. You remember once before we are visiting Scandinavia, you remind me, if you come back from Scandinavia, don't ever think to abandon Muhammadiyah or Nahdlatul Ulama because of the capacity to organize. And if you are come up with the idea that the design of organizational or institutional design is what really political in that sense, then this is simply because of the technicality or the design of the policy, rather than the so-called political in the broader sense. So that the broader alliance that we are complaining so far is not really the big factor. Is it the case? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Purva. I think you bring up extremely important questions to proceed with, to continue with here, because it partly relates to my critique of what happened with the with the campaign for the public health reform, that it was a campaign for one reform, but once the reform was the victory was there and people returned back home, and then we were sitting quarreling with Said Iqbal and others and say, come on, why do you now give priority to your very specific issues? Can't we, form a broader alliance on the basis of this and that as well? Why do you have to return to that? And why are you linking up with Prabowo and so on and so forth, right? But that's one thing. But you are bringing up an additional extremely important question, which is, how does one negotiate the specific design of these kind of reforms, and how can one have a participatory framework for their implementation? And how can one, in addition to that, as you mentioned, how would one, we have to admit that the welfare states in Northern Europe were built primarily in Protestantistic, in Christian Protestant countries, where the church had been where the state had appropriated much of the resources of the church. So they couldn't have their extensive, how shall we say, religious-based welfare services as it was possible in the southern part of Europe, and which is possible here through Enu, Muhammadiyya, and so many others. So how does one handle that? How does one combine their capacity without turning it into a fragmented kind of welfare system where we get small kind of move like Hamas or you know, which or for that matter, even worse, the Indian Hindutva movement, Modi's government being entirely popularly based on one hand, certain oligarchs, on the other hand, on an extensive welfare, private welfare system of small movements catering to their sympathizers. So how does one do this? And I think you are actually hitting the nail that this is, you know, this is really what should be given emphasis to when we discuss these kind of reforms. It needs to be discussed, of course, by experts who can make comparisons and bring in examples, but also there must be partnership representation so that there are guarantees that the reforms, for instance, are catering to at least some of the needs of the production-oriented entrepreneurs. Otherwise, they will not be willing to support it. It's important that they are interested in promoting, for instance, kindergarten, because they are interested in more female workforce, so they need kindergartens and so on and so forth. And this has to be debated, discussed. There must be forums for that. So I 100% agree with what you say. There has to be more research on that. There has to be more studies on exactly those issues. I would love to see such a project, you know, coming up, but I'm getting old.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Ule and Mas Purwo for the response. Mas Jo actually mentioned that if he want to raise a response, but before that, we have another question online from Mbak Ayu. Mbak Ayu said that we currently witness a global movement against right-wing populists. She wondered whether you see this as another potential opportunity or opening for new social democracy, as you mentioned in the book.
Yes and no. Let me phrase it like, let me be a bit, how shall I say, provocative perhaps. I agree very much with my friend in the Philippines, Dr. Joel Rocamora, when he says, you cannot win any election against Duterte or his followers by only emphasizing human rights issues, but only focusing, only in quotation mark, focusing on his war against the poor people who are dependent on drugs, etc., etc. Because people also need two things. They need welfare, they need protection against the precarious work conditions, and so there must be welfare schemes combined with precarious, countering the precarious work conditions. So, because if these issues are not addressed, people are looking for strongmen. And therefore, I think that the movement against the right-wing populism has to be like in Kerala, it has to be combining the civil rights with the welfare issues. Then we can stand up against the Hindu fundamentalists. Otherwise, I'm you know, no, we simply can't just raise the banner of democracy and civil rights and human rights. It's simply not enough. Social democracy, strength of social democracy is to combine that with the social rights. If that is not made, I'm afraid we lose out.
Thank you, Prof. Ule. And now I will invite another response from the participant who attend on this venue. Mas Dio? Yeah.
Sudah selesai, Mbak Linda? Yeah, because this will be a little bit heavier because you mentioned the name of my she is my grand teacher, Chantal Mouffe. And you mentioned here about agonistic politics and social democracy has something in common. But then I think you mentioned in the next paragraph, and you describe that the left populists favor unmediated direct democracy. I don't think this is the Chantal Mouffe position, because if that's so, I mean, like she's digging her own grave for her theory, because the underlying presupposition of her theory, not the agonism, but her theory of discourse and hegemony, is that reality is basically discursive. So any identity is never immediate. It is always discursively mediated, and that's the thing that I think quite a bit. You're not totally missing it, but you tend to overlook it when you mention about this kind of like broad alliance for democracy. You mentioned several historical moments. Probably we can go back to the slide where Ola. Oh, okay. You mentioned the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1970s, and then what next? Democratization or in Spain after the death of Franco. I wasn't born yet at that time, but then the democratization in the Philippines, the People's Power Movement, 1986. I was 6 years old. And then in Greece, and then you mentioned also Indonesia. But what came after those revolutions? What we had, of course, it varies from one country to another. The democratic regime that came out after those revolutions, they now with different degree, of course, they are facing what you just mentioned, the populist or right populist threat in each of those countries. And some may have responded very well, probably with Podemos in Spain. And then at some moment, Syriza came in Greece. But not always the same in other countries, and we also know that Syriza is facing its own crisis in Greece. So I think what you're missing here, it's not only about like the need to form a broader alliance, but you mentioned that term, negotiation, the room for negotiation in each of this contingent trajectory of the democratic regime. And that's the thing. I think you mentioned you are right when you say that this is not only structural, this is also political. And this negotiation is one of the main manifestation of this irreducible, ineradicable political dimension. You need to provide spaces for people to have negotiation in its broader sense. It includes kind of like conflict, debates, disagreement. And you need to, this negotiation needs to be institutionalized. So people becomes used to have different opinions to make their points. And also they become used to accept that at some points, at some moment, their ideas may be excluded from from the policy decision, but there are always next opportunities for them to bring forward what they have in mind. I think that's one important point that when we talk about social democracy. Not only this kind of like broader alliance, because this broader alliance has its own time. It always comes in specific historical moment. What is democratic at one point may not be so democratic in other point. And yeah, that's the thing that I suggest you to think about, especially after you mentioned that this left populism favors that sort of immediate democracy. No, I don't think so. Especially Chantal Mouffe. Probably some other left populist thinkers and movements favor this immediate democracy. But for Mouffe, she will say that I'm sure she will say that everything is discursively mediated, and the discussion about politics, it becomes possible because of this mediatedness. That's from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mas Jo, for the interesting question. But before we move on to Prof. Ule, I would like to inform that we unfortunately have reached near the end of this event, so we cannot entertain another response. Okay, and now we will move to dari kamu tim, Mas. Okay, and Prof. Ule, you may want to.
Yeah, just I understand short of time. The problem that the main problem that I try to bring up is the tendency of not immediate democracy, but direct democracy in terms of, you know, the neglecting the systems of representation that have to be built up. It's on that point where the disagreement comes up, and we don't have time to go into in depth in discussing that. But the mediation you talk about, the discursive mediation, is certainly important. But and I have no major problem with that. It is the problem of, you know, which was so visible, for instance, in Solo, where that direct democratic kind of sitting in restaurants and chatting and agreeing on certain things, and then not being institutionalized, not being therefore possible to move ahead with, and a lot of these things affected also the discussions between unions and movements and society organizations and Djokovic's rise to power. So it's that question that I'd like to raise. There are a lot of vital and important aspects, precisely this form of direct democracy, and I think that the rather boring social democratic system of interest representation and all of that is worth taking seriously. But we have to continue to debate on that at some other occasion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Ule. Directly. Okay, and since we have entered the end of our event today, before closing this event, I would like to invite Prof. Ule or maybe Mas Najib also. Do you want to give a closing remark? Okay. To close this event, I will give opportunity for Prof. Ule for giving the conclusory remark, and also one of the online participants asked where to find your book online.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I guess the slideshow is not possible to revive again, is it? There is could you take the very final slide?
Okay, but we need 2 minutes.
All right, I'll talk for 2 minutes and you do it. Well, thank you for the interest in the book. I think the easiest way of getting hold is to get it as an ebook. That's the cheapest way. There is some propaganda in the end of it. Text the next one, the next slide. Anyway, if one can then buy it through Bloomsbury.com, and there is a code for those who have participated in book discussions and so on, so that you can get 35% discount if you use that code. Yes, do you see that code? Take down that note. 35% discount on ebook for seminar participants through Bloomsbury.com. Use code GLRTW9UK. GLRTW9UK. That gives you 35% discount on the ebook. 35. And I'm happy that they have published it in paperback, you know, so it's not that very expensive actually. Yeah. I would like to round up by saying that it was not just a pleasure to meet and a delight to meet old friends and so on, but also to get very sharp comments. I'm deeply thankful for that. Even though I'm now forced into retirement because of welfare state regulations, I hope we can keep in touch one way or the other, because all the years through, it has come to be like that. It has come to be that probably most of my friends are in Indonesia, India, and the Philippines, and I don't want to lose all of them. Thank you so much.
Okay, and that marks the end of our book discussion event today. Lastly, I would like to thank Prof. Ule, of course, for giving his presentation. Mas Najib and Mbak Linda, unfortunately she's not here, and also the participant who attend this event, both online and in the venue today. Thank you.
Enggak, bayar aja.
Organization of the